Hello, welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail. I'm Mike Bowdendistel. I'm the head of intermodal solutions here at FreightWaves. Work primarily on the data side, on intermodal data. And I'm here joined as always by my colleague Joanna Marsh, who does the editorial writing at FreightWaves on the rail industry. Joanna, what are you working on these days? I know you've seen you publish a lot of reports about earnings season and so forth, but what else is going on?
Yeah. So I think the Class One railroads just kind of wrapped up their earnings season. There's still some rail companies that still have to post results, like Trinity Industries, for instance. But
Mhm.
yeah, there's that. There's news coming out of California and the California Air Resources Board looking at whether to phase out diesel locomotives and phase in zero emissions locomotives. And so we'll see how that
Mhm.
goes. They're supposedly supposed to talk about it today. I'm not sure if that's going to be done today or if vote on it today or if it's going to extend to tomorrow as well. So there's that. And then the Federal Railroad Administration just issued a safety advisory on train lengths to
Mhm.
just kind of telling the railroads to be mindful of how they when they configure trains, thinking about the length as well because of the in train forces with that could happen with train lengths, longer trains.
That could cause the rail cars to decouple essentially because the in-train forces, is
Yeah,
that the issue? They're blocking
the
rail crossings or more likely to derail?
yeah, I think they did for multiple reasons. I think part of it is sort of the derailment issue and whether it does or doesn't sort of split the train
Mhm.
apart in terms of the decoupling. And then part of it, I think, is also the rail crossings issue. There's been some reports in sort of the mainstream outlets about blocked crossings and
Mhm. Mhm.
how that affects the local residents. Of course, that's an ongoing issue. So we'll see.
Well, great. So encourage everyone to go check out those stories on freightwaves.com. You can always go at the top to sectors and just look at the rail road coverage. You'll get all of Joanna's articles in addition to some of the other articles that are written that pertain to the rail industry. And with that, as just a brief intro, I want to really save most of the time for our guest today. Have Jefferies, who is the president and CEO of the Association of American Railroads. The AAR is an organization that works to ensure the long-term viability of the railroad industry, really working on behalf of the Class One railroads. Ian, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Always great to have your perspective, sort of the perspective of the railroad industry. And I guess I just want to start with labor's really been a big issue. I was just listening to the Norfolk Southern analyst call, and they said, one third of their locations, they don't have the labor that's yet at targeted levels. It's really been kind of an issue that's been intensified, during the pandemic. During other times, the railroads are pretty able to sort of scale their resources with volume. Had a little bit hard time getting people, back to the job during the pandemic. Can you give some sort of perspective, on that? Sort of why was it more difficult this time? What do you think the railroads have to do to make the job maybe more enticing to a younger group?
Sure, that's a great question and one we could probably spend the entire episode talking about. But yeah, I think you really need to go back to 2020 and the throes of the pandemic. And railroads have a long history of during traffic, during volume declines. We saw a fairly dramatic one in the spring of 2020 of temporary furloughing workers when the work isn't there, and then calling them back when the volumes return. That's a process that had worked for decades upon decades, and frankly, that process broke down, and the process that railroads had relied on, it didn't perform as it has historically. I think, I'm kind of pulling these numbers, but historically, upwards 80-90% of folks who were furloughed when recalled came back to the job, and I think that number was cut in half in certain situations. And so volumes came back pretty strong, probably stronger than most folks had forecasted, and railroads got caught in a game of catch up. As you know, um, we can't just hire somebody and have them out on the railroad the next day. It takes significant amounts of training, which takes significant amounts of time before folks are ready to be out on the road. And so we've been industry-wide at a pretty aggressive hiring clip since probably 2021, and the numbers, top-line headcount is up a pretty decent amount. I think we're up about 10% from where we were January 22. Got the most employees we've had since the beginning of 2020. So a lot of progress has been made on that front. But to your point and to the comments, I think that were made around one of the earnings calls. There's certainly pockets that remain significantly challenging throughout the network. Certain areas fully sourced, other areas remain a challenge. And you hit on the notion that how do these roles need to evolve? Certainly, today's railroad is not yesterday's railroad, and today's workforce is not yesterday's workforce. Especially in the pandemic, I think every industry probably saw an evolution of employee values, employee desires, and one thing that we learned. Very significantly, very starkly in our labor negotiations is that there's a premium on trying to strike that right work-life balance, increase quality of life, ability to have more predictable schedules, and that's something that we're working very hard on. And in fact, something that the last fall's collective bargaining agreement actually had specific direction that on a railroad by railroad level, with our operating crafts, our engineers and our conductors, that the railroads sit down with those crafts and create a more scheduled work cadence that, frankly, is good for the employee. If you have a more predictable work schedule, you can design the rest of your life much better, but also it's better for the railroad to have a more predictable pool of available employees on any given day. So that's ongoing, and hiring continues in the meantime. But we're not in all pockets where we want to be, so the work continues there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think all those things, with work-life balance, predictable hours, those type of things would make a big difference. How do you think about sort of the balance between the railroads' sort of profitability levels, return on investment versus the demands on service?
Hmm.
The service has come under fire in recent years. The Foster Farm situation, the Union Pacific embargo situation. Does there need to be sort of a different, maybe less variable cost structure to have more resources in place for when volumes surge?
Well, I think you're always going to see an effort in every industry, including railroads, to make sure you're making the best use of your assets, you're controlling costs to the best extent you can. But what we have seen, and call it applying lessons learned, is that several of our leaders, several of our CEOs across the rail industry have been very clear about the fact that they're not going to necessarily rely on the old paradigm of temporary furloughs and calling folks back quite as much as maybe as they used to, and folks are going to look at temporary downturns in volumes and demand as opportunities to retrain or to train conductors to be engineers, or really try to keep that more resilient workforce ready availability there. Because again, we saw when you get caught short on headcount and you have demand, you can't just flip a switch and put more people out on the network. It takes a lot of time. There's lag time there, and so I'm certainly pleased to see that our leadership in our industry is making a point of emphasizing that fact. That whether it be in public speeches, conferences, earnings calls, et cetera, that there's going to be, I think, a desire to keep more of a resilient level of workforce there, and maybe not necessarily look to furlough if there's a temporary downtick. Everyone's going to manage their network to the best of their ability and based on the characteristics of an individual railroad's network, and of course that could be different for each railroad. But that's a pretty consistent theme you're hearing across the first quarter from our leadership.
That's good.
Yeah,
That should help with
I've kind of heard
employee
that as
retention
well,
also.
like during the earnings calls about if there is a market downturn, kind of focusing on the training with the conductors and others, and sort of seeing whether career opportunities are out there. I guess kind of looking at a little further on that reprioritization question. So you have sort of that transitioning idea about furloughs and looking at employee training in terms of like market downturn. What about like do you think that the industry is in a is a period of reprioritization away from improving operating ratio and towards service and volume growth? And or I guess another way to put that is the PSR era over, or are we in PSR 2.0, as like Tony Hatch might say? Where do you
Right.
think the railroads kind of stand with that thing?
Well, as you all know, probably better than a lot of folks, that term is thrown around pretty liberally, and each railroad has its own unique operating plan, of course, and it's going to operate based on its customer base, its physical network, et cetera. But um, again, building up on the themes that we've heard from our industry's leadership over the past 4 or 5 months, there's been dramatic emphasis on top line growth, on service, on getting service to new heights, and really growing that market share. There's a lot of opportunity out there, even during some uncertain economic conditions. The investments are being made, the work's being done to not only grab share right now, but really be ready, as the economy gets rolling back into full force, hopefully sooner than later. Our industry and our railroads are doing their best, I think, to work with customers to forecast what the expected demands might be. That's a bit of a cloudy process, even at the best of times. And so, kind of expecting uncertainty is probably a bit of the new model out there. But service, top line growth, adding cars to the volumes, and competing vigorously to make our product more attractive, especially on that intermodal in that intermodal market that's so dynamic.
Yeah, on that point, we do hear a lot about intermodal trying to gain share. Lots of investments are being made. Just saw the partnership between Canadian Pacific and what was it, Schneider. Lots of things like that are pretty interesting. JB Hunt with partnership with BN, et cetera.
Mhm.
But sort of look at the past few years, intermodal really hasn't gained share from truckload. I mean, we always sort of look back after a period of tightness in truckload and say, well, the railroads should have gained share, and it was this opportunity, missed. What sort of prevented that share gain from taking place the last few years, including the tightness that we saw in, let's say, 2021 in the truckload industry?
Well, I think, part of it is it's such an integrated network when it comes to intermodal. And so when what we saw so clearly, I believe really fall of 21, where you had unprecedented volumes coming out of the West Coast ports. Trains were getting goods into the middle of the country, Chicago hub, for example, and our yards started getting backed up because the lack of drayage, lack of chassis, lack of warehouse space to take the products to, and so the system kind of backed up on itself. And there's a lot of progress that's been made there. I think really creating an increased level of visibility through the supply chain is going to help. But at the end of the day, we're going to win share when we provide hyper predictable, reliable service. It doesn't necessarily have to be the fastest service, I think, but it has to be extremely reliable, extremely predictable, and transparent. In that, the world, the customer base, you and I, we've all grown accustomed to knowing exactly where our orders are and where things we're buying are in the supply chain on any given time. Shoot, you order a delivery pizza, you see when the pepperoni goes on it, of all things. So
Hmm. Hmm.
I think there's an expectation of increased visibility into shipments, and the more progress we make on that front, the more attractive our product will be. And so it's a multi-pronged approach there, but the opportunities are there, and I think we're working to be ready to take advantage of them.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess you mentioned earlier about maybe during volume downturns, railroads could train, let's say, conductors to be engineers. I mean, that sort of leads to the other sort of question on top of people's mind. I think is that issue of two-person crews versus one-person crews versus, I don't know, maybe zero-person crews if the safety measures are really in place, longer term. So sort of what are your thoughts there? I mean, I guess, does the AAR believe that it's more efficient to have just a locomotive engineer in the cab and the conductor on the ground? And would that detract from safety at all in your view?
Right. So First of all, I think we try to avoid using the term, two-person crew or one-person crew. What we're really talking about is where crew members are physically located and whether or not it's appropriate to, in some cases, to redeploy a conductor from inside the cab of a locomotive to along the right of ways, prepositioned, stationed along the right of way, and certainly there are positives there in certain situations. We talked about the quality of life desires from the workforce, and if you have a situation where you have a utility conductor who covers a certain territory on the network, has set hours, is doing that Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. It's shift work. It's predictable. You know when you're going to work. You know when you're going to be home. I think there's a lot of desirable advantages there. But what we're really focused on, I think, this is a much bigger picture, is locking in current operating practice in perpetuity. And whether or not that's how many folks are located in the cab of a locomotive, whether that's how we do certain types of inspections, in our opinion, legislation and regulation really needs to be focused on how we can evolve into the future. And permanently locking in current operating practice doesn't really allow that ability to innovate, to evolve, to develop new better ways to do things. And so that's where we get pretty concerned. But when it comes to crew deployment and potential redeployment, that's always been a matter for collective bargaining between railroads and their unions. It's worked well over the years. It is a slow evolutionary process. When you look at data, safety has only improved over the decades that we've redeployed various crew members. And so our railroads will continue to have those discussions if they deem appropriate with their unions about crew deployment and potential redeployment. But where we do get hung up is, really locking in current operating practice in the regulatory or legislative space. We don't think that's appropriate. We don't think that's promoting innovation. We don't think it's promoting technology, which will really result in advances in safety, advances in efficiency, et cetera.
Mhm.
Yeah, and actually to follow up on that, you know, there have been, as you can see with the data in the Federal Railroad Administration, decline in railroad derailments over the last decade, and I think maybe even over the last 20 years. Obviously, the goal is zero derailments, but for the time being, what can be kind of done to make railroads safer and to reduce derailments? So you mentioned the technology issue. But what other options are there?
Sure. Again, a question we could probably spend the entire conversation on, but you made some good points on safety trends. So if we look at 2022 using FRA data, we had several record safety metrics in 2022. They weren't all records, so we're not where we need to be. But when it comes to mainline track derailments, all-time record low. We have about the Class One railroads have about 900. 2022 had 916 derailments across the entire industry. Only 24% of those occurred out on the main line, so out on the roads themselves. The vast majority, about 75%, occur within yards. Call it more minor incidents. So there are different causes for different incidents. 2022 we had the lowest employee injury rate in our history. But again, to your point, we're not at zero, and our goal should be new safety records every single year. So we've got to keep evolving how we do things. What are the opportunities? The opportunities are really pushing out deployment of track inspection technology using new tools, using autonomous track inspection, for example, which allows for a much more in-depth, sophisticated inspection of a track, kind of a 360 holistic picture of a track, using a tool that can be attached to a locomotive, can be its own car, but allows us to really cover vastly more miles of track and vastly more frequently than having an individual walk the track. And using those tools, we can pinpoint where there might be an anomaly in the track, and then the employee can be the person who goes in and really gets into that and does the repair work. And so it's using tools like that that again will result in more track being inspected more frequently at a higher level of sensitivity. There are other opportunities out there as well, whether it's using new types of materials, whether it's using new types of wayside detection. It's got to be an all of the above strategy, and some things are going to bear fruit, others aren't. But that's why we need to be able to work in our space and work collaboratively with our regulator to be in the lab and looking for new, better ways to do things, and understanding that not everything's going to have the leap forward we're looking for, but some might, and we should be able to deploy pilot programs to build those data sets to really take a look at what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, you bring up a good, I mean, your point's well taken that you don't want to lock current procedures in place because that would stifle a lot of this innovation. A lot of the innovation would lead to a safer railroad because you can find exceptions and things and
Hmm.
correct those before they become bigger problems. So, I think that point is very well taken. Also wanted to ask you about the Surface Transportation Board. I mean, now that they have approved the CPKC deal, I'm sure that was taking up most of their time. Maybe they have time to look at some of these other things that they've outlined kind of this laundry list of things: reciprocal switching, redefining the carrier
Hmm.
common carrier obligation, streamlining procedure for small shippers and contest rate cases. I'm sure there's others I'm missing, but any that you would sort of really highlight as ones that you would say tread cautiously on because
Right.
for one reason or another?
Well, I think that's generally our theme with all things the STB looks at is tread with caution,
Mhm.
because these are big consequence issues that the board's looking at. But all kidding aside, this board is very engaged, probably the most active any STB's ever been. But it's also been an unprecedented time over the past few years with the pandemic and other related issues and other supply chain challenges we've dealt with. So as the board looks at these issues, I think we're focused on a few different things. The chair's made clear he wants to focus on switching. We call it forced access, but and
Mhm.
he's held a hearing last spring, 2-day hearing on this. And if you watched and listened to really what the focus of a lot of the questions was, are there opportunities to use switching as a service remedy? If one railroad is having service challenges or not performing at a level a customer deserves and expects, is there a way the board can order a switch to a competing railroad who might be able to provide a better level of service? There might be an argument to be made there. Our view is let's proceed with caution. Let's proceed deliberately, and let's make sure we are addressing real issues out there. And if it's about rate regulation, the board has multiple other tools, multiple other avenues here. But if it's about service, maybe there's something there. The devil's always going to be in the details. But the chair has made clear this is something he wants to deal with. Certainly, I give him a lot of credit because he has worked very hard to drive consensus at the board, and that's
Mhm.
a challenge because you've got five very sharp, very uh, diverse viewed individuals. And so I think he deserves credit for his effort in bringing people together. And so I know that'll be a focus. And that's why, frankly, I was surprised that there was a split vote on some of the smaller rate case stuff. The final offer rate
Mhm.
review program that the board, through a split vote, is trying to set up. We've got pretty significant concerns about that, really, in that the board doesn't have statutory authority to set up a baseball style arbitration. Their job is to determine what the maximum reasonable rate is, and the way this
Mhm. Mhm.
program as proposed is set up, it kind of they abscond themselves from their responsibility of doing that. That's going to be litigated, and we'll see where that goes. Not to say there aren't opportunities to improve a small rate case process. There certainly are. This may not have been the right path, though. But more to come on that.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, appreciate your perspective on that, on all those things. Um,
Yeah.
have about a minute left. Maybe just any thoughts on how the CPKC deal might change the sort of the trade flows throughout North America. I think that's something that's interesting.
Yeah, that one's going to be pretty interesting because you are seeing a lot of activity coming out of the cross border market right now. Whether it's obviously that deal's in place now, and they're working on combining operations between the two former companies into one. But you've seen other partnerships announced with competing railroads, and of course you mentioned. railroad and intermodal partners that already exist and are pretty robust. But I think you're going to see a lot of activity. I think there's a lot of volume at stake, and then a lot of, frankly, potential growth that folks who operate on the border see as a real potential. Pull in a lot of that truck traffic to the extent we can out of the waiting lanes at the border gates and onto the rail, which I think is more efficient on so many different levels when it comes to emissions, when it comes to congestion, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's going to be pretty exciting to watch here over the next year or so. And I think there'll be a lot of excitement, a lot of good activity, and a lot of interesting partners developing through this. So I think it's actually really healthy and something that we should all look forward to seeing how it plays out.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Be great to watch. So thank you
Yeah.
so much, Ian, for joining us. If folks want to sign up for the newsletter that you guys do, what is it, the Signal? How can they do
Yep.
that to be kept up to date?
Yeah, we've got the Signal. We've got so many different resources on AAR.org. You can catch us on LinkedIn, Twitter, all that good stuff. So certainly encourage people to check it out. And thanks for having me today. Look forward to talking again.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you.
Okay, have a great day.
All right. Take care.